Although the influence of Wittgenstein's thought on contemporary philosophy is great, I shall not attempt to measure the extent of that influence. I shall instead mention some of the main ideas and the development they undergo in three of his books: the Tractatus, the Philosophische Bemerkungen, and the Philosophical Investigations. But first, let me say a word as to who Wittgenstein was. He was an Austrian born in Vienna in 1889. He died in Cambridge, England in 1951 at the age of 62. As a young man, he studied engineering in Germany and England. His interests switched to logic and philosophy. He went to study with Bertrand Russell at Cambridge just prior to the First World War. Very quickly, he began to develop some of the ideas that were contained in his first book, the Tractatus. In the war, he served first as a private, then as an artillery officer, and during this time he carried notebooks in his knapsack in which he wrote out the thoughts of the Tractatus. After the war, Wittgenstein gave up philosophy. He also gave away the large fortune that he had inherited. He served as a school teacher in a small village of Austria, in several small villages, for a period of 6 years. He worked as a gardener's helper in a monastery. He was engaged for 2 years in designing and directing the construction of a modern mansion in Vienna that was built for one of his sisters. But Wittgenstein suddenly returned to philosophy. He came to Cambridge in 1929 and began intensive work. He also gave lectures, which exerted a powerful influence. When Professor G.E. Moore retired from his chair in Cambridge, Wittgenstein was appointed to that chair. But then the Second World War broke out, and Wittgenstein found it impossible to remain a spectator. He worked in English hospitals for 2.5 years, first as a porter, then as a laboratory assistant. In the spring of 1944, he resumed his lectures at Cambridge, but after only 2.5 years, he resigned his chair. He strongly disliked academic life, but also he felt an urgent need to devote his energies exclusively to the development of his philosophical ideas. A year and a half before his death, he learned that he had a fatal disease. He continued to think and write with great intensity up until the very end. Now, as I said, I'm going to try to outline some of the main ideas of three works of his: the Tractatus, the Philosophische Bemerkungen, and the Philosophical Investigations, and I proceed to the Tractatus. In a notebook, Wittgenstein wrote, "My whole task consists in explaining the nature of sentences." The question that he asked himself was, how is it possible for a combination of words to represent a fact in the world? How is it that by producing a sentence, I can say something, can tell someone that so-and-so is the case? Now, Wittgenstein's explanation consists in the striking idea that a sentence is a picture. He meant that it is literally a picture, not merely like a picture in certain respects. Apparently, this thought first occurred to him when he saw in a magazine an account of how a motor car accident was represented in a law court by means of small models. So he says in the Tractatus, a sentence is a picture of reality. A sentence is a model of reality as we think it to be. The dolls and the toy cars could be manipulated so as to depict different ways in which the accident might have taken place. They could be used to construct different propositions about the accident, to put forward different accounts, different models of what took place. His conception was that when we put a sentence together, we construct a model of reality. He says in the Tractatus, in a sentence, a situation is, as it were, put together experimentally. Now, one would not normally suppose that a spoken or printed sentence is a picture. According to the Tractatus, it really is a picture of what it represents. Wittgenstein conceived the proof of this to be that although the words that we have not previously encountered have to be explained to us, when we meet for the first time a sentence which is composed of familiar words, we understand the sentence without further explanation. He says in the Tractatus, I understand a sentence without having had its sense explained to me. Now, this can appear to one as a remarkable fact, and if it is a fact, the only possible explanation would seem to be that a sentence shows its sense. It shows how things are if it is true. And this is exactly what a picture does. A new sentence composed of old words is able to communicate a new state of affairs by virtue of picturing it. In any picture, according to the Tractatus, there has to be a one-to-one correspondence between the elements of the picture and the things in the state of affairs that it represents. If one element of a picture stands for a man and another for a cow, for example, then the relationship between the picture elements might show that the man is milking the cow. A picture is a fact, namely the fact that the picture elements are related to one another in a definite way. A picture fact shows that the things which the picture elements stand for are related in the same way as are the picture elements. According to the Tractatus, a picture must have something in common with what it pictures. This common thing is the picture's form of representation. There are different kinds of pictures, different pictorial notations, different methods of projection. In short, there are different forms of picturing. For example, some pictures are composed of sound, and some are not. But there is a form which all pictures must possess in order to be able to picture reality. This is called the form of reality, and also it's called logical form, and is defined by Wittgenstein as the possibility that things in the world are related as are the elements of the picture. A picture can depict reality, but it cannot depict its own form of picturing or its own form of representation. It depicts or represents its subject matter from outside, but it cannot get outside itself to depict its own form of representation. A picture of another form might depict the representational form of a given picture. For example, a picture in sound might depict the representational form of a picture in color, but in order for the one to represent the form of the other, there must be something which is the same in both. I quote, "There must be something identical in a picture and what it depicts to enable the one to be a picture of the other," unquote. Therefore, logical form, the form of reality, which all pictures must possess, cannot be depicted or represented by any picture. Now, this consideration must apply to sentences, since they are pictures, according to Wittgenstein. We make assertions by means of sentences. With a sentence, we say something. Things in the world are related in a certain way, and we try to describe that. But we cannot describe how our sentences succeed in representing reality, truly or falsely. We cannot say what the form of representation is, which is common to all sentences, and which makes them pictures of reality. We cannot say how language represents the world. We cannot state in any sentence the pictorial form of all sentences. I quote, "What can be said can only be said by means of a sentence, and so nothing that is necessary for the understanding of all sentences can be said," unquote. This doctrine implies that in a sense one cannot say what the meaning of a sentence is. In respect, for example, to the sentence, A is larger than B, one can explain to a person what the words A and B each refer to and what the word larger means, but there is not a further explanation to give him, namely, what the sentence A is larger than B means. You understand the elements of a sentence and you see how they are combined, but you cannot say what this combination means, yet you grasp its meaning. In some sense, you know what it means because the sentence shows its meaning. Anything that can be said clearly, but not everything that is understood can be said. In a letter to Bertrand Russell, Wittgenstein remarked that his main contention was this distinction between what can be said in sentences, that is, in language, and what cannot be said but can only show itself. And this, he said, was the cardinal problem of philosophy. The picture theory of propositions is at the same time an account of the nature of thought or thinking. Wittgenstein says, I quote, "A thought is a sentence with a sense," unquote. This implies that thinking is impossible without sentences, that is, without language. Since a thought is a sentence and a sentence is a picture, so is a thought a picture. The totality of true thoughts would be a true picture of the world. To say that a state of affairs is conceivable, that is, thinkable, means that we can picture it. A thought contains the possibility of a state of affairs, for the logical form of the thought is the possibility that things in the world are combined as are the constituents of the thought. Whatever is thinkable is possible. In a spoken or written sentence, a thought is made perceptible to the senses. All thoughts can be stated in sentences. What cannot be stated cannot be thought. A consequence of these views is that the common form of representation of sentences, that is, the form of reality, which cannot be stated, also cannot be thought. Language shows us something we cannot think. Obviously, the Tractatus is a thoroughly metaphysical work. This is no minor tendency of the book. Yet, oddly enough, it was once widely regarded as being anti-metaphysical in its outlook. There is some excuse for this interpretation, since at the end of the book, Wittgenstein says that the correct method in philosophy would be to prove to anyone who wants to say something metaphysical that he has failed to give a meaning to certain signs in his sentences. If somebody tries to say something metaphysical, you prove to him that he has failed to give a meaning to certain signs in his sentences. But Wittgenstein does not reject the metaphysical, rather he rejects the possibility of stating the metaphysical. According to the Tractatus, the ultimate elements of language are names. A name is a simple sign which stands for a simple object. States of affairs in the world are configurations of simple objects. A picture in language, that is a sentence, is formed out of a combination of names. The combination pictures a configuration of objects. The combination of names is like a tableau vivant, a living picture. One might think here, for example, of a group of people posed to represent the Last Supper. A combination of names, by virtue of portraying a configuration of objects, portrays a state of affairs. Many, if not most, of the actual signs of language, according to Wittgenstein, are complex signs, and they are not names. A sentence which consists of a combination of genuine names is called an elementary proposition. It is not analyzable into other proposition. It directly portrays a combination of simple objects. The picture theory is apparently meant to hold for all propositions and not merely for elementary propositions. For Wittgenstein says without any qualification, I quote, "A proposition is a picture of reality," unquote. Both elementary and non-elementary propositions are equally pictures. The difference is that the pictorial nature of an elementary proposition would be manifest. I quote, "It is evident that we perceive an elementary proposition as the picture of a state of affairs," unquote. Whereas, as Wittgenstein admits, most of our sentences, the ones that we actually use, do not seem to be pictures, although they actually are. All propositions, according to the Tractatus, are analyzable into elementary propositions. This analysis of our ordinary sentences, with their complicated modes of symbolizing, would make manifest their concealed pictorial nature. Every proposition has one and only one complete analysis into elementary propositions. The completely analyzed proposition will consist of simple names. The meaning of each simple name will be a simple object. The particular way in which the names are combined in the sentence will say that the simple objects in the world are related in the same way. To understand the completely analyzed proposition, one need only understand the names, that is, know what objects they stand for. What their combination means will be immediately evident. To understand a proposition requires merely to understand its constituents. The notion that there must be elementary propositions was not an arbitrary assumption. Wittgenstein was trying to solve the question of how language and thought can be related to reality. His basic intuition was that language pictures reality. If this is so, then among the sentences of language there must be some which show their sense immediately. This does not mean, of course, that their truth is self-evident or even that they are true. They show their sense immediately. Wittgenstein had no criteria for identifying elementary propositions, never gave any examples of elementary propositions, nor of names, nor of simple objects. He had a purely a priori viewpoint on the matter, that there must be elementary propositions. He couldn't give any general account of their subject matter, but if his intuition was right, namely that the relation between language and reality is that language pictures reality, then it would seem to follow that there must be elementary propositions, that is, propositions which show their sense immediately and of which all other propositions are truth functions. If this were not so, no sentence could say anything or could be understood. Now, the Tractatus exerted a strong influence on the so-called Vienna Circle of logical positivism. Moritz Schlick, the founder and leader of this movement, declared that the Tractatus had brought modern philosophy to a decisive turning point. It is true that there is considerable agreement between the predominant views of the Vienna Circle and the positions of the Tractatus. For example, they agree in these positions that all genuine propositions are truth functions of elementary propositions, that logical truths are tautologies and say nothing, that philosophy consists of no set of doctrines, but is an activity of making thoughts clear. Those are some of the positions in which there is agreement between the Tractatus and the Vienna Circle, but there are fundamental differences. The Vienna Circle did not adopt the picture theory of sentences, which is the central idea of the Tractatus. A conspicuous doctrine of the Vienna Circle, which is not found in the Tractatus, was that all genuine propositions are reducible to propositions that report direct perceptions or what is given in immediate experience. And a corollary of this viewpoint is the famous thesis or principle that the meaning of a statement is its method of verification. I will say something later about Wittgenstein's relation to this principle, but as far as the Tractatus is concerned, the topic of verification is not even brought into it. The only proposition there in the Tractatus which seems to resemble this thesis is the following, quote, "To understand a proposition means to know what is the case if it is true." To understand a proposition means to know what is the case if it is true, unquote. Even here, nothing is explicitly said about verification, and an immediately following comment shows that Wittgenstein was not thinking about verification. For he goes on to say, a proposition, quote, "is understood by anyone who understands its constituents," unquote. That is to say, if you understand the words in a sentence, you thereby understand the sentence. There is no mention of a requirement that you must know how to verify what the sentence says. And indeed, that is not the position of the Tractatus. The position is that to understand a sentence, one must know the reference of the names that compose it, and that is all. When you understand a sentence, you know how reality is constituted if the sentence is true, regardless of whether you know how to verify what it says. The picture theory is not a verification theory of meaning. Logical positivism and the author of the Tractatus were both opposed to metaphysics, but in different ways. From the standpoint of logical positivism, there was nothing at all behind metaphysical propositions except possibly their author's emotions. Metaphysicians are musicians without musical ability, said Carnap. But in the view of the Tractatus, one can gain insights into the presuppositions and limits of language, thought, and reality. These metaphysical insights cannot be stated in language, but if they could be stated, they would be true and deep insights and not mere muddles or expressions of feeling. Wittgenstein, as I said before, abandoned philosophy for nearly 10 years. For 6 years, he was a school teacher in village schools in Lower Austria. And as I said, he worked as a gardener's helper in a monastery. He worked as the directing architect of a daring piece of architecture. In 1929, he suddenly returned to philosophy and pursued it with characteristic intensity until his death in 1951. And during those 22 years, he thought and wrote prodigiously. The first product of this new work, entitled Philosophische Bemerkungen, philosophical remarks was not published until 1964. It was written in the years 1929 and 1930. That is, immediately after his return to philosophy. It is a work of great interest, not only in its own right, but also because it shows a philosopher in motion. One sees in the Bemerkungen some of the beginnings of the extraordinary transition that occurred in Wittgenstein's thinking from the Tractatus to the philosophical investigations. I will mention some of the changes in viewpoint that begin to appear in the Bemerkungen. In the Tractatus, Wittgenstein had held that all elementary propositions are logically independent of one another. One elementary proposition can neither contradict nor entail another elementary proposition. In the Bemerkungen, he is worried by something that seems to upset this position. This is the fact that two colors or two shades of the same color cannot simultaneously be in the same place, nor can a body have two lengths or two velocities at the same time. In general, different degrees of an attribute cannot simultaneously apply to the same thing. Yet, a degree of an attribute cannot be analyzed as a logical product, that is, as a conjunction of degrees. That is, if a stick is 3 yards long, we cannot say that it is 2 yards long and also 1 yard long. And if we gave numbers to shades of color and so said that a certain shade of red, for example, is degree 5 of red, which we could do, this could not mean that it consists of degree 1 and degree 2 and degree 3 and so on of red. Propositions that describe degrees of attributes cannot be treated as truth functional compounds. They are unanalyzable, and therefore they are elementary propositions. Yet, different degrees of the same attribute exclude one another. Consequently, two elementary propositions can contradict one another, and therefore a basic conception of the Tractatus is overturned. Now, Wittgenstein's resolution of this problem is characteristic. He exchanges one image for another. In the Tractatus, a sentence is conceived of by him as a picture that we compare with reality. The sentence or the picture is, quote, laid against reality like a ruler, unquote. In the Bemerkungen, a new image emerges. An elementary proposition is not thought of as a ruler, but as a graduating line on a ruler. The system of propositions to which the elementary proposition belongs is the ruler. He says, quote, I do not lay a proposition against reality like a ruler, but a system of propositions, unquote. An attribute such as color or length or pain is called a coordinate of description. The degrees of an attribute are the determinations or values of the coordinate. The length of something has only one value on the coordinate of length. It coincides with just one of the graduating lines on the ruler. The same with a shade of color or a degree of pain. Each elementary proposition belongs to a coordinate of descriptions. A coordinate is a system of possible determinations. Each determination excludes all the others. Now, this development in Wittgenstein's thought was undoubtedly an important stage, I think, in the transition from the Tractatus to the investigations. The so-called new philosophy of the investigations did not emerge in one leap, but grew, in part at least, from struggles with unsolved problems of the Tractatus. In the Tractatus also, a proposition is conceived of as belonging to a system, that is, to a range of possible states of affairs called logical space. It is said that each proposition in the Tractatus, that each proposition presupposes the whole of logical space. In the Bemerkungen, a system of propositions is called a space. There is a space of colors. That is, that system of propositions attributing colors to things. A space of pain, a space of numbers. Only in a space, he says in the Bemerkungen, can one ask a question or carry out an investigation. Each space has a grammar. I think that this means roughly that in each space or system there are logical connections between sentences, and there are combinations of words that make sense and other combinations that are nonsense. Now, although in both of these works, that is, the Tractatus and the Bemerkungen, there is the idea of a propositions belonging to a system or to a space of propositions, the Tractatus conceives of there being just the one logical space to which every proposition belongs and which is presupposed by each proposition. The whole of logical space is presupposed by each proposition. But in the Bemerkungen, there is emerging the notion of a plurality of spaces or a plurality of systems of propositions. Not so that each proposition belongs to a space or a system of propositions, not to the system. And thus, Wittgenstein is beginning to make the passage from, one might, what at a later stage he would have called the super concept of the one language unified by the essential nature of propositions. He's making the transition from this view, which is embedded in the Tractatus, to the concept of the investigations of an endless variety of diverse and autonomous language games, each embodying a different form of life. The central doctrine of the Tractatus, the picture theory, seemed to Wittgenstein to be proved by our ability to understand the sense of a new sentence without having it explained to us. The elements of a sentence are coordinated with the elements of reality in such a way that we see how things must be in the world if what the sentence says is true. Each elementary sentence is a picture, and each non-elementary sentence is a truth-functional construction out of elementary ones. Now we notice how this theory is beginning to break down in the Bemerkungen. No longer is it thought that a single sentence is compared with reality, but rather a whole system of sentences is compared with reality. Now perhaps it is possible to hold that the system is a picture of reality. But it seems to me that the picture conception is losing its charm. I can think of a sentence on a printed page as a literal picture because I can look at it and compare it with reality. I can take the sentence in one glance. But the system to which it belongs is nothing I could look at or see, so it cannot literally serve me as a picture. The Bemerkungen also reveals a marked development in Wittgenstein's conception of the relation between meaning and verification. The origin of the verification principle of the Vienna Circle has been obscure. The verification principle is what I mentioned before, namely the meaning of a proposition, the meaning of a sentence is its method of verification. As I say, the origins of this principle have been obscure. Once it was widely assumed that this principle came from the Tractatus, but we noted that the picture theory of the Tractatus is not a verification theory of meaning. However, on the evidence of the Bemerkungen, I myself think it is highly probable that the verification principle did originate with Wittgenstein, although not in the Tractatus, but in the new philosophical thinking that began in 1929 and some of which is embodied in the Bemerkungen. And the verification principle, or this idea, could have been transmitted to the Vienna Circle by means of Wittgenstein's talks with Moritz Schlick and Friedrich Weissmann in 1929, 1930, and 1931. These talks that Wittgenstein had with these gentlemen were often, in fact, informal lectures by Wittgenstein, and in fact, that's the form they normally took. As you will see, the Bemerkungen is strongly verificationist, and I will quote some sentences from it to show this. The sense of a question is the method of answering it. Tell me how you are looking, and I will tell you what you are looking for. A question always corresponds to a method of finding out. To understand the sense of a sentence means to know how to decide whether it is true or false. It is not possible to believe something one cannot conceive of as verified in some way. Each sentence is the guide to a verification. How a sentence will be verified is what it says. And in regard to a particular type of sentence that he was concerned with, and with regard to the question of how to determine what the sense of that type of sentence is, Wittgenstein remarks that, quote, we can apply our old principle. Now, our old principle, I'm sure, can be nothing but the verification principle. We can apply our old principle and say that we shall recognize its sense if we consider what verifies it, unquote. So that there is ample evidence from the Bemerkungen that the idea of the verification principle was a very powerful driving force in Wittgenstein's thought in 1929, 1930. From the testimony of G.E. Moore, however, we know that by 1932, Wittgenstein had made the discovery that the utterance or avowal, the sentence, I have a toothache, does not have a verification. I mean, Moore testified to this from the lectures of Wittgenstein, which he attended in Cambridge. Now, this discovery of Wittgenstein's, namely that the utterance or assertion, I have a toothache, does not have a verification, carried the implication that the verification couldn't be the whole story about meaning, and that therefore that the verification principle couldn't be the whole truth. And so that this discovery implied a turning away from the full-blown verification theory of meaning. Now, Wittgenstein's philosophical investigation Investigations, the third work I'm going to talk about, does not contain a verification theory of meaning. At the same time, it regards the possibility and method of verification as highly relevant to meaning. Wittgenstein's view in the Investigations is that if you are puzzled as to what someone's statement means, one of the most clarifying moves you can make is to ask him about its verification, what its verification would be. How would you verify it? In the Investigations, he says, quote, "A question about the manner and possibility of verification of a proposition is only a special form of the question, how do you mean that? The answer is a contribution to the grammar of the proposition," unquote. So, the answer to the question about verification will throw some light on how the speaker is using the sentence in question. It will be a contribution to the meaning of his statement, although not necessarily or even probably the whole story. Wittgenstein began writing the Philosophical Investigations in 1936. And that was 7 years after his return to Cambridge to renew his philosophical work. It was published posthumously in 2 parts. Part 1 was complete by 1945. Part 2 was written between 1947 and 1949. Between 1930, when Wittgenstein completed the Bemerkungen, and 1936, when he started the Investigations, he produced a large quantity of work, only part of which so far has been published. Wittgenstein believed that the Investigations could be better understood if one saw it against the background of the Tractatus. A considerable part of the Investigations is an attack, either explicit or implicit, on the Tractatus. And this development, I imagine, is probably unique in the history of philosophy. A thinker producing, at different periods of his life, 2 highly original systems of thought, each system the result of many years of intensive labors, each expressed in an elegant and powerful style, each greatly influencing contemporary philosophy, and the second being a criticism and rejection of the first. Now, as we saw, it is held in the Tractatus that any sentence presupposes the whole of language. Quote, "If objects are given, then at the same time we are given all objects. If elementary propositions are given, then at the same time all elementary propositions are given. If all objects are given, then at the same time all possible states of affairs are also given," unquote. An elementary sentence is a combination of names, and in order to understand the sentence, one must in some sense know the objects for which the names stand. In understanding any sentence at all, one must know some objects, but then, Wittgenstein held, one must know all objects and all possibilities. Any proposition whatsoever carries with it the whole of logical space. And now this view is connected with Wittgenstein's belief in the Tractatus that sentences or propositions have an essential nature. The essence of propositions, he says, quote, "is the essence of all descriptions and thus the essence of the world," unquote. And the essence of propositions is the same as the universal form of proposition. That there is a universal form of proposition is proved by the fact that all possibilities, all forms of proposition must be foreseeable. Not all actual states of affairs must be foreseeable, of course, but all possibilities must be foreseeable. Now, that's the viewpoint of the Tractatus. In the investigations, Wittgenstein emphatically rejects the idea that each significant sentence carries with it the whole of language. A sentence does presuppose a language game, but a language game will be only a small segment of the whole of our language. An example of a language game occurs in the second paragraph of the investigations. There is a builder and his helper. They're building something. The building materials are blocks, pillars, slabs, and beams. The two men have a language consisting of the words block, pillar, slab, and beam. The builder calls out one of the words, and the helper brings the building material that he has learned to bring at that call. The builder calls out slab, and the helper brings him a slab. And Wittgenstein calls this combination of words and actions, you've got a mixture of words and actions here, he calls that a language game. And Sprachspiel. He says that it is complete in itself and could even be conceived to be the entire language of a tribe of people. If we think that as language it is incomplete, we are merely comparing it with our more complex language that contains a vast number of language games. Now, according to the Tractatus, every form of proposition can be anticipated because a new form of proposition would simply represent a new combination of simple objects in logical space. It would be like grouping the pieces on a chessboard in a new way. I mean, here's logical space, here are the simple objects. We can arrange them like this, we can arrange them like this, but we must be able to foresee all possible arrangements of the simple objects in logical space. It would just be a different arrangement of what you already have. But in the investigations, a new language game would embody a new form of life, as Wittgenstein puts it, and this would not be merely a rearrangement of what you already had. Suppose, for example, that the people of a certain tribe use language to describe events that are occurring or have occurred, for example, men walking, running, or fighting, that it's snowing or raining, and so on. They use language to describe such events, but they do not have any imaginative use of language. That is, they do not, for example, tell fibs, or they don't pretend that it's raining, or that something is happening which isn't happening. They don't make contrary to fact suppositions, or they don't engage in any imaginative play at all. That is, they do not even engage in the behavior of pretending. Their children would not, for example, walk around on all fours and growl as if they were tigers. And we could even suppose that these people might not understand kidding. If one of us said to them something obviously false and then laughed, they would not know how to take it. Now, what these people would lack would not be words, but the behavior and reactions, responses that enter into the language games of imaginative play. Those people would not be capable of foreseeing a use of language to convey a play of imagination. They would not even understand it when they encountered it. And there is no reason to think that a new use of language, embedded in a new form of life, in a new set of responses, must be foreseeable any more than to think that, for example, the rise of non-objective painting must have been foreseeable. The Tractatus assumes that there is an essential nature of language, something which is common to all forms of language, and by virtue of which they are forms of language, something that makes them forms of language. The Investigations rejects this assumption. It holds that there is nothing common to all language games, just as there is nothing common to all games. Wittgenstein asks us to reflect in detail on the various kinds of games there are: ball games, card games, guessing games, and on the variety within each kind of game. If we try to select some feature common to two games, we shall find that it will be absent at some other place in the spectrum of games. What makes us group this range of activities together as games is not some feature common to them all, but, as Wittgenstein puts it, a multitude of relationships overlapping and crisscrossing. He employs the analogy of a family resemblance. Sometimes there is a striking resemblance between several generations of the same family. Close study may reveal that there is no feature common to all members of the family. Neither eyes, nor build, nor coloring are always the same. The family resemblance is due to many features that overlap and crisscross. Now, the unity of games is a family resemblance, and so is the unity of our different forms of discourse, our different language games. Philosophers have a characteristic tendency to assume that there is an essential nature of knowledge, or an essential nature of art, or an essential nature of poetry, or of propositions, or an essential nature of language. And Socrates, for example, always wanted to know what knowledge is, or what justice is, and he would reject any proposal which was not a common feature of all cases of knowledge or of all cases of justice. He ought to have been satisfied instead with overlapping similarities, and so ought the author of the Tractatus when he searched for the essential nature of propositions and the essential nature of language. Now, if the picture theory is the center of the Tractatus, it is important to see how Wittgenstein's new thinking in the Investigations judges that theory. Surprisingly, there is not much explicit discussion of it in the Investigations, and what there is usually enigmatic. But if we take a long view of the new philosophy, there can be no question that it rejects the picture theory. In both works, Wittgenstein is concerned with the question, how can language represent reality? Both philosophical systems are centered on the same question, but the answers are different. Instead of holding that a sentence has meaning by virtue of being a picture of reality, the Investigation says that the meaning of a sentence is its use, Gebrauch, or its employment, Verwendung, or its application, Anwendung. Some readers of Wittgenstein have doubted that he speaks of the use of a sentence. They know that he speaks of the use of a word, but they have doubted that he speaks of the use of a sentence, and others have thought that in any case it is wrong to speak that way. On the first point, there can't be any doubt. Wittgenstein speaks of the use of a sentence in many passages. For example, he says in paragraph 23 of the Investigation, quote, "There are countless different kinds of use of what we call symbols, words, sentences," unquote. The other objection, however, is more important, namely that it's wrong to speak of the use of a sentence. I mean, many philosophers have said this. It's okay to speak of the use of a word, but not to speak of the use of a sentence. They would say, as I said, a sentence cannot have a use. We learn the use of words. We don't learn the use of sentences. We understand sentences without having their sense explained to us because we understand the use of the words that compose them. Now, it's obvious that this view has common ground with the picture theory of the Tractatus. In the investigations, there is more than one objection to this view. For one thing, Wittgenstein denies that we understand every grammatically correct sentence that is composed out of words which we do understand. Wittgenstein denies that this is the case. Take, for example, the sentence, "I am here." There is a philosophical inclination to believe that each time one utters the sentence, "I am here," one says something that is both significant and true. Wittgenstein makes the following comment, quote, "A philosopher says that he understands the sentence, 'I am here,' that he means something by it, thinks something, even when he doesn't consider at all how or on what occasions this sentence is used," unquote. Wittgenstein is saying that this sentence, "I am here," has sense or meaning only in special circumstances. In other circumstances, we do not understand it. That is, we do not know what to do with it. Now, the outlook of the Tractatus is entirely different. An elementary sentence is a combination of names, and if we know what the names refer to, then we understand the sentence, for it shows its sense to us. The circumstances in which it is uttered or written, that is, the circumstances, which in the investigations are so important, in the Tractatus, the circumstances in which it is uttered or written have nothing to do with the matter. Now, the investigations regards this view as absurd. What does the sentence, "I am here," show? Certainly, it does not show its use. What can it mean to say that it shows its sense? A significant sentence is a tool with which a certain job is done. By looking at a sentence, you cannot always tell whether it is a tool or, if it is, what job it is used for. The investigations denies the claim that was the basis of the picture theory, namely, quote, that we understand the sense of a propositional sign without its having been explained to us, unquote. That quotation was from the Tractatus, and I'm saying that the investigations rejects that view. Now, as I said, the Tractatus holds that language is ultimately composed of names, that the meaning of a name is a simple object, and that the sense of a sentence arises from the combination of names that compose it. One name stands for one thing, another for another thing, and the combination depicts a state of affairs. A sentence says something because it is composed of names that stand for things. In the investigations, there occur three objections to this viewpoint. First, the meaning of a word is never the thing, if there is one, that corresponds to the word. Second, the Tractatus's assumption of simple objects is rejected. The contrast of simple and complex, Wittgenstein holds in the investigations, is relative to a language game, and nothing whatever is intrinsically simple. Third, a thing does not even have a name except in a language game. To find out what a name stands for, one must already have some mastery of the language game to which the name belongs. In order to learn the name of a color or of a compass direction or of a sensation, one must be able to perform correctly in some of the activities into which the name enters. For example, to classify some objects according to their colors, or to read a map or a compass, or to respond to the words and movements that are expressions of sensation. The kind of use a word will have, the circumstances in which it will be said, must be settled before it can even be a name. I think one could say that on the viewpoint of the Tractatus, a significant sentence is conceived of as being like a mechanism. If the parts fit, then the whole thing works and it gives you a picture of reality. If the parts do not fit, it is like cogwheels that do not mesh. There is a clash of meaning. But in the investigations, the following is said, quote, "When a sentence is called senseless, it is not, as it were, its sense that is senseless," unquote. It is not as if the sense of the sentence prevented one from using the sentence. When we say that a sentence is senseless, we are announcing our refusal to use that combination of words, and we could do this for various reasons. It is not that we see that the sentence cannot have a use because the meaning of the words cannot be combined. Instead of the fundamental notion being a sense-making combination of words and the use of the sentence being derivative from this, it is the other way around. Wittgenstein says, quote, "Look at the sentence as an instrument and at its sense as its employment," unquote. Suppose it seemed to you that some sentence, for example, take the sentence, "I am asleep." Very good example to reflect on. Suppose it seemed to you that this sentence had sense or was a picture. But on the other hand, you couldn't think of when or where or on what occasion it should be used. You tried hard, and it is difficult to think on what occasion it would be appropriate for you to say, "I am asleep," to somebody. Now, shouldn't the fact that you cannot think of any appropriate circumstances in which you should say this sentence, that is, you can't think of any case in which it should be used, shouldn't this make you doubt that the sentence has sense? That is, isn't the question of whether a sentence has a use in the language the criterion of whether its component words are a sense-making combination? And if so, the use of a sentence is the primary fact and not whether its words are in a pictorial combination. This criticism of the picture theory may be stated somewhat differently. Suppose that a sentence were a picture. There would still be a question of how we should apply the picture to reality. If someone showed you, for example, this is taken from the investigations, if someone showed you a drawing of a cube and told you to bring him one of those things, he drew a drawing of a cube on a piece of paper and handed it to you and told you to go and fetch one of those things, you might in good faith bring him a triangular prism instead of a cube. I mean, you can see it that way, as a triangular prism instead of a cube. And in other words, more than one way of taking this drawing was possible. It suggests a cube, but it is possible to take it differently. Or a picture represents an old man walking up a steep path, leaning on a stick, but could it not also represent him as sliding down the hill in that position? It is more natural for us to take it in the first way, but the explanation of this does not lie in anything intrinsic to the picture. A picture of a green leaf might be understood to be a representation of the color green, or of a specific shade of green, or of leaf shape in general, or of a particular shape of leaf, or of foliage in general, and so on. I mean, one and the same thing might be understood in all of these different ways. A green leaf might even be a representation of the complementary color, red. How a picture is used will determine what it is a picture of. It cannot, therefore, be a fundamental explanation of the sense of sentences to say that they are pictures. Wittgenstein hints in the Investigations that the picture theory is plausible because we tend to think of portraits that hang on our walls and are, as it were, idle. If we instead considered something like a builder's blueprint, then the activity of using the picture would be seen to be the important thing. Now, this discussion of ours might suggest the following view, and I'm drawing to a close. How a sentence or picture is interpreted will determine what use is made of it. How a man responds to an order, for example, will depend on how he understands it, and whether the one who gave the order will be satisfied with that response will depend on what he meant by the order. What a person deduces from a proposition will depend entirely on his understanding of the proposition. Wittgenstein himself wrote in one of the notebooks of the Tractatus, quote, "What propositions follow from a proposition must be completely settled before that proposition can have a sense," unquote. By virtue of grasping the meaning or the sense of an expression, we know how to employ it, we know when to say it, and what action it calls for. Instead of meaning being identical with use, on this view it comes before use, and use is based on it. When you hear a sentence and understand it, or give an order and mean it, the action required in obeying the order or responding to the sentence is already, in a sense, taken in your mind. In your act of meaning or understanding, quote, "your mind, as it were, flew ahead and took all the steps before they were taken physically," unquote. In taking or accepting those physical steps, you would be ratifying what has already transpired in your mind. To do differently would be inconsistent with the previous mental act. Consistency requires you to take these steps or draw these conclusions. Understanding carries compulsion with it. Now, this idea of logical compulsion is vigorously rejected by Wittgenstein in the Investigations and in his writings on the foundations of mathematics. Is Wittgenstein rejecting deductive reasoning and logical necessity? No, he is objecting to this philosophical picture of, or image of logical necessity, namely that when I have understood a proposition and am then supposed to say what follows from it, I must deduce such and such consequences because it was already settled in my understanding of the proposition that it would have those consequences. Wittgenstein's criticism of this imagery creates a continuity between his philosophy of psychology and his philosophy of logic. A part of his criticism could be put as follows. Suppose that two people, A and B, have received the same instruction in elementary arithmetic. They have been given the same rules and illustrations, have worked through the same examples. Later, when they are required to perform some arithmetical operation, A does it right and B does it wrong, although B thinks he's done it right. We shall say, of course, that A understood the operation, understood what was to be done, and B did not. Now, what does this come to? It could have been the case that the sole difference between them was that A wrote down the correct numbers and B wrote down incorrect ones. Now, if this fact is our criterion of a difference of understanding, then it would be wrong-headed to postulate a difference of understanding to explain the fact that A and B wrote down different answers. The inclination to insert an act or state of understanding as an intermediary between, say, hearing an order and executing it is an example of what Wittgenstein calls a general disease of thinking. It consists in always looking for and finding mental states or acts as the sources of our actions. The assumption of mental states to explain our actions comes from what he calls a one-sided diet. If we let our view range over the family of cases of what we call differences of understanding, we shall discover some in which the only difference between two people who understand a certain proposition differently was in their drawing different conclusions from it. So that Wittgenstein is saying that our understanding of a rule is not a state that forces us to apply the rule in a particular way. Someone who has received the ordinary instruction in arithmetic or chess and has applied it normally in the past could go on in the future in a different way and still be a rational person. He might even be able to give a reasonable defense of his divergence from the common way of going on. But Wittgenstein is not denying that there are rules and that we follow them. He is holding that the way a rule is applied in concrete cases determines its meaning, determines the meaning of the rule, the way it's applied in actual concrete cases. When a rule is merely formulated in a sentence, it hangs in the air. What puts it on the ground is what we say and do in actual cases, and here there is an overwhelming agreement between us in what we say and do in actual cases, given a common training. We nearly always say and do the same thing, and this widespread agreement in particular cases determines whether some action is or is not in accordance with a rule. Instead of saying that we agree because we follow rules, it is more perceptive to say that our agreement establishes the rules. Rather than thinking of mankind as coerced by the rules of logic and language, we should think that the content of the rules is fixed by the practice and agreement of mankind. So to conclude, we have observed the development of Wittgenstein's thinking about the sense of sentences from the picture theory of the Tractatus to the verification theory of the Bemerkungen, and finally the rejection of both theories in the philosophical investigations in favor of the conception of a sentence as being a tool and its sense as the agreed-on use of that tool. Thank you.